Hey everyone, it's Michael from michaeldrewmusic.com. Today we are talking about the big one, the major scale. Now there are all kinds of scales. There are major scales and minor scales. There are modes. There are scales from other regions of the world. But the foundation of Western music is certainly the major scale. And so I wanted to devote an entire video to this one scale. If you're new to scales, this is the place to start. This is the one scale you want to know before anything else. I was recently just reminded of the importance of scales. My wife and I decided to take the plunge and pick up a hammered dulcimer. And this is a beautiful instrument. This is an Appalachian instrument. We got it just this past week here, and I am awful at it. I am a novice. I am learning it slowly and painfully. But because I know scales, because I understand music theory, once I knew how the instrument was tuned, I was able to quickly start to pick out melodies and quickly start to play things that sounded like music, despite having no technique and no experience on the instrument. And it did occur to me that if I didn't have any theory knowledge, if I didn't know any scales, I would just be guessing around on this thing. I mean, I would just be playing random strings until something sounded right. That would take so much longer and be so much more frustrating if that were to be the case. And so that's one example of many as to why we use scales and why they are so important. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today is how do we use scales? Why do they matter? I think the keyboard is the best example of this. I think it's the easiest way to see how scales work. So we're going to pop on over there now. We're going to break down the major scale. So to understand the major scale, the first thing we are going to do is we are going to take a look at whole steps and half steps briefly. Now, a half step would be the smallest distance in music that we can move. Okay, so if I'm on a note like D here, okay, a half step up simply means I go up to the very next note, whether it be a white key or a black key. Okay, so here's D. There's a half step up, right? D sharp would be going up one half step from D. If I'm back to D and I want to go a half step down, that would be D flat there. Okay, now if I'm on E, a half step up is F. So a half step is not always going to a sharp or a flat. Sometimes it's just going to the next letter name in the musical alphabet, and that depends upon where you are, what note you're on. But a half step just means we go to the very, very next note. Okay, now a whole step would be two half steps. This would mean we go up two notes or down two notes. So again, if I'm on D, a whole step up, 1, 2, is going to be E. E is a whole step up from D. A whole step down, 1, 2, would be C. If I am on E, a whole step up would be F sharp, right? So I'm going from a white key to a black key there for a whole step. Whole step down, 1, 2, would be D. Now the major scale has a certain pattern of whole steps and half steps. And I want you to try to memorize this if you can. The pattern is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Okay, 2 whole steps and a half step, 3 whole steps and a half step. That is the pattern of notes that gives us the sound of the major scale. Now, how do we define a major scale? Well, that's one way, the patterns of whole steps and half steps, right? We could say that a major scale is a pattern of notes that goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That's one way we could define it. I think a very simple way to define a scale would be simply that it's a set of notes that sound good together. That's a good definition. It's a way of organizing our notes that is pleasing to the ear. That's a good way to put it. We could also say that the major scale is a tonal center. We could say that it's the foundation that we build music on. Now, I also want to draw a line of connection between scales and keys. Scales and keys. I remember being a young musician, just getting started, not really knowing any music theory, and being in a musical situation with some people that knew more than I did, and them saying, hey, let's jam in the key of G, and having no idea what that meant. What does that mean? So it basically means that we're going to play a song that is using notes from the G scale predominantly. When you are playing in the key of G, you are building your song on the G scale. The chords you are using are chords based on the G scale. The notes you are using are the notes from the G scale. Now, that doesn't mean there's a rule that you can't use notes that aren't part of the scale. Those are called accidentals. So you certainly can use any notes that you want. But it means that the notes of the scale are going to be the foundation. They're going to be primary. They're going to be the ones that we rely on the most when we are playing in a particular key. So I want you to remember that. When somebody says the key of C, we should think about the C scale. When somebody says the key of G, we should think about the G scale, and so on. Okay, so now that we've defined the scale and we've looked at the whole step and half step pattern of how a scale is built, let's put this into practice, okay? Let's see if we can apply this now. And I'm going to start in the key of C as I usually do, because I think that's just the easiest key to see what's going on. And once we do that, then we can go ahead and go back and plug this into some other keys here. So if we're in the key of C, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, right? So C to D, whole step, right? Because there's a half, so C to D is a whole step. D to E, also a whole step. E to F, half step, okay? You follow me? So we've got whole, whole, half. F to G, whole step. G to A, whole step. A to B, whole step. B to C, half step. So there it is. Whole, whole, half. Whole, 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 half. In the key of C, that just so happens to be all white keys. Okay, and there's our sound. That's what it sounds like. That would be a major scale. So that's the key of C, all white keys. Now, there are 12 notes in one octave in music. We have the 7 white keys and the 5 black keys. Each one of those notes has a scale that is built upon it. Okay, so we end up with 12 major scales. And what if we were to start this pattern on a different note? Okay, what if we were to start the pattern on G? Okay, so let's plug that in now. G to A, whole step. A to B, whole step. B to C, half step. So far, so good, right? We've got whole, whole, half. C to D, whole step. D to E, whole step. E to F, half step. Uh-oh, so what happened? Our pattern is incorrect, right? Because now we got whole, whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole. See how those last two are reversed around now. And this is going to sound like this. Okay, now you can hear that almost sounds like the C scale did. It almost sounds like a major scale, but right there at the end, something goes wrong. It doesn't sound quite right. And that's because that pattern of whole steps and half steps has been disrupted. So what do? This is where the black keys come in. Okay, what we have to do is we have to sharp the F, because if I do that, then we've got, check this out, whole, whole, half, whole, whole, sharp the F, whole, now E to F sharp, and then half, F sharp to G. Now we've got this sound. And that's the sound we're going for, right? So we would say that the key of G sharps the F, or the G scale sharps the F. It has to make the pattern work, right? It has to make the pattern sound correct. Okay, so the G scale has an F sharp in it. Now, if we looked at the key of F as an example, we go whole, whole, whole. Okay, now there's a problem already, right? Because whole, whole, that should be a half right there, right? Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So what do we have to do? We have to flat the B. So we've got F to G, whole, whole, half now, whole, 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 half. Now it works. Right? So there's the F scale. Okay, but I had to flat the B. I had to lower that B down to the black key to make that one work. Okay, now you may be wondering, why do some scales have sharps and why do some scales have flats? Now that gets into some deeper theory stuff, but I think it's worth taking a quick look at here. So a couple of rules that we want to remember with scales. First of all, the scale pattern, the major scale, has to fit the whole step and half step pattern, like we already talked about. So we know that it's got to fit that pattern. But secondly, every scale has to cycle through all 7 letter names. Okay, so every scale has to have every letter name in the musical alphabet. Going back to the G example there, if I played that G scale and I called that F sharp a G flat, what would happen? I would have two G's in my scale, right? A G and a G flat, two notes with the letter name G, and I would have no Fs, right? I would have G, A, B, C, D, E, G flat, G. So even though the half step and whole step pattern there is correct, the spelling of it would be incorrect, right? That would be an improper spelling. That would be very confusing to think of it that way, and we've got to have all 7 letter names in there. So that is why some scales have sharps and some scales have flats. Now I've got 4 quick reasons why scales are important. I'm going to be releasing a video on each of these 4 topics later on, so I'm not going to get into them in detail right now, but I do want to briefly mention them just so that we have some idea of why scales even matter. Okay, so the first thing would be what I mentioned at the top of the video. If we understand scales, we're going to be able to pick up on things much quicker in music. We're going to be able to learn a new instrument quicker. We're going to be able to read music quicker. We're going to be able to play by ear even better, because if we can learn to hear scales in music, that's going to really help us. If we recognize that sound of that scale and we hear that in other places, that's going to help us learn to pick up on it quicker. So in my opinion, scales just make everything more efficient. Secondly, transposing. What if we have to move a piece higher or lower for whatever reason? Maybe it's for a vocal range, maybe it's for a different instrument. Knowing scales enables us to do that. So if I've got a melody, like my favorite test melody here, right? And I have to move that up, let's say to the key of E. Okay, how did I know to play those 2 black keys there? Because I know the E scale, and I know the notes that are sharped in the E scale. So if I move to the key of E and I did this, that does not sound correct because I'm not plugging in my scale. I'm not plugging in the sharps or flats in the scale, the key signature. So transposing makes very little sense without a knowledge of scales. Number 3, improvisation and composing. Going back again to the story that I told about jamming in the key of G with other people that, I didn't know what the key of G was. If you know your scales, when somebody says, hey, let's jam in the key of G, you know that your go-to scale is going to be the G scale, right? If you're in the key of G major, the G major scale is going to work. That is so important. When you see people improvising solos, they are improvising, but they're also using patterns that they've learned. So nobody's ever truly improvising in the sense that they have no idea what's going on and they're just totally winging it. We've all learned patterns, regardless of how much music theory we actually know. Everybody's using patterns. And so scales, yeah, we need them to improvise. We need them to compose, right? If we want to be able to write melodies and compose melodies, an understanding of scales is essential. Otherwise, again, you're just guessing. You're just sort of guessing around, and we don't want to guess. We want to be able to really know what's going on. Finally, we've got to know our scales if we want to understand chords. There's a big emphasis on chords because so much pop music, that's all it is. It's chord based, right? And chords are great. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we want to understand chords, taking the time to understand scales is so important. I just did a video on intervals, and same thing. Intervals relate to scales, which relate to chords, right? We have to take the time to understand these things to really get the most use out of our chords. If we want to be good at chords, if we want to understand how to use chords in music, taking the time to understand scales is so important. So I would certainly recommend that if your goal is to play chords. Well, thanks everybody for checking out this brief tutorial on the major scale. I will have much more content on scales coming very soon, so please stay tuned for that. If you found this video to be at all helpful or informative, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and to like this video down below. That really helps me out. And as always, I hope that this has encouraged you in your pursuit of music, and I hope you have a wonderful time making music, and I look forward to seeing you next time.